Hi, I'd just like to talk to you about importing the template face or the template soft tissue head that we are going to begin our modeling from. Now at this point you should have your skull in place and your tissue depth markers and the eyes and even the drawings in your scene. You can see I don't have that yet in my case, but all the same we have to bring in the template head to start modeling from. Now, typically when you do this sort of work, you would start from scratch. Now, probably starting from a cube and subdividing it to approximate the shape of the head. Now, personally, having done this a number of times, I've seen that there's sort of a basic shape that we can start from a little later on in the process. That's what I call my template head, which can be used for any skull and just adjusted to match. What's important is that it's got a minimal amount of resolution or not that many points and faces, so it's still easy to edit. That is, to change its shape to match the skull you're working on, but it has all the basic elements of topological flow that we want to preserve to match the underlying structure of the soft tissue, the muscles of facial expression, for example, and the tension within the soft tissue. So that if we were to deform it or move the topology around to match the features of the skull, it will do so in a way that respects what the underlying architecture of the soft tissue should be. So, having said that, you should have this set up in a project already. If I go here to File, Project, I don't have to set it because I already have, but if I just go to Edit Current here, I can just show you. Mine is set up on my desktop in this case. It's got a name. And all my scene files, and that means a Maya file, are going to be stored in a folder called Maya. So you should have downloaded from the website the template head .ma file, template head 01.ma file, and here's my project here. We've got our Maya folder here, and I've dragged that head template in here, and here's the skull file here. So when we're back in Maya with the skull file open, we can go to File, Import, and we don't really need to open up the option box. We can change the settings in the window that will appear. So we have to navigate to where it is. Mine's on the desktop, CFR Dryer 2013, and I know it's in the Maya folder here. You can see it's grayed out. I can't select it. That's because it's looking for OBJ files or object files. In this case, ours is a Maya ASCII file or a .ma file, so I'll select that. Now it's selectable, and we'll import, and we'll bring that object in. Now you'll see right off the bat that our skull is oriented in a different direction than the head. Now we could turn the skull around if we wanted to, but it's probably easier just to reorient the head. Now the first thing that I would probably do in this case, well, no, let's revolve it first. So select the model that was just imported and note that its name is here. And we want to rotate it, E for rotate, and start turning it around the y-axis by grabbing the green circle. And you can see that it's rotating in Y up in here in the top right in the channel box. And I can just click in that attribute and type in 90, so it rotates it around 90 degrees. So that seems to fit pretty well. Now you can see that it doesn't fit the face perfectly, and that's fine. The skull that I made this for might have been slightly thinner or differently shaped. And again, I don't have the tissue depth markers on here. But if it was far too small or far too big, I could simply press R for scale and scale it up or scale it down. But in our case, the fit is pretty good. And it should be, because most skulls are going to be sort of the same size, depending on the individual, of course. So you might need to scale it up or scale it down, but this isn't bad, actually. So now that I've got it into place, you can see that my translate, rotates, and scales up in here in the top right are all have values in them. If I go to modify freeze transformations. And I'll just as a note here, for some reason my version of Maya is crashing whenever I use these menus up at the top here. That's why I'm using the hotbox. So hold down the space bar to get the hotbox and go to modify freeze transformations. And then you can see it zeroes out all of these values, except for scale, it sets it to 1. So now I would save, of course. Now, there are different ways to do this, and as you know, you're saving, if I just open this up, you should have incremental save turned on, which means it makes a duplicate of your file every time you save, which is great in case you have to go back a few steps if your file becomes corrupt. However, you'll start filling up space quite quickly. If we look here in the Finder, my skull is 40 megabytes, so it's not that big. I reduced it so it wouldn't take up that much space, but every time you save it, if you save it 10 times, that's 400 megabytes. If you save it 100 times, then we're getting up to 4 gigabytes of space. And you might start running out of space in your incremental save. So eventually, if this project folder here is getting too big, you can go into these incremental saves and delete some of the earlier ones if you don't think you're going to go back to them, or save them out on somewhere else on a computer at home or something so you can always return to them. But save some more make sure you save the more recent ones in the project so you can return to them if there's a problem. So now that we've got this in here, we might want to go and start tweaking the shape to match our skull a little bit more. Now, one thing I want you to be sure of while you're working in here is that you keep these midline points, the ones running down the mid-sagittal line or close to it, in the midline. Now, we're not going to reflect the head. We might reflect it to look at it later on, but in the final product, what I want you to have is the skull sticking out of half and half the face modeled. That way, as a finished product, it's interesting to see both together. Now, really, you would reflect it on the other side and tweak it to match the other side of the skull. However, we're not going to do that, but we still want to keep our midline points in the midline. So if we look in our side view, which in our case shows the front of our skull, I have selection highlighting, turned off here. Now, the skull might not be perfectly in the midline itself, but we can move it over, or you may have moved your skull already, so we can leave it like that. And now I just would want you to go in and start tweaking it a little bit so some of the major shapes of the face match your skull. So here, right click over it and go to vertex. Now you can see that it's selecting the mandible and the skull here. I don't want those selectable. Now I know that you should already have it set up this way. If I click on the skull and the mandible, and in the display layer on the right underneath the channel box I click this far right button, it will create a new layer and add those two elements to it, and I can turn those on and off. I can name this layer skull, and in addition to making it visible or invisible, I can click on this next box and click it twice and it goes into reference layer, so I can't select it now. Now I can only select the geometry that I want to manipulate. I've got some extra stuff in here, just delete that. So now with this selected, I can right click and go to vertex, and I can select these vertices here. Now what I want to avoid, when I say I want to keep these points in the midline, I don't want to select these midline points and move them to the left or the right, essentially, because then they're no longer in the midline. However, I can move them up and down. That's not a problem. So just be careful. Now when you're working in Maya, you can see I'm using the perspective view to select my points. You can see I have these points selected here near the chin. And I can also move things in the perspective view. I can grab the axis and move things around. Now you can see I'm grabbing the arrows of the axis, and I'm doing that on purpose so I don't move things in the Z axis, or sorry, the X, well in this case it's the Z axis, by accident. I want to keep those things in the midline. So I can move that out. And I can also move the box, grab the box in the middle of our manipulator, and I can move things around. That means I can move freely in all three axes, and I don't want to do that. The other way to do this is to select in the perspective view, tap your space bar, and then move things in your side view, or in this case, your front view. Now we're looking at the wrong side of the skull in this case. So we can change our front view to a back view by going to this box up here, click the arrow on the side, and then click the arrow again. Now we're looking at the back, and we can leave it like that. So I can use the perspective view to select points and move them using the arrows, or I can pop into these different views and move them down. Now I can see it looks like I missed a point in here, so I can maybe select this one under the mandible and just pull it down. Select these points and move them out. So I'm just doing some rough changes to make this template face fit this skull a little more closely. This might be a little too tight up in here under the chin, and under the jaw, sorry. You can look in this view here. I can go to form mode. Now this gets confusing as you work here, but you can see I can try and match this. Now you'll have some tissue depth markers to work in here. Now the tricky part is that when you're working in this view and say I select some points here, I could be selecting points on the back of the head too, and you always have to be vigilant and look around to make sure you haven't inadvertently selected something you didn't want to. Now, in this case I know I have, because I have these points selected here. You can see the manipulator handle is here. That means it's an average position between all the points selected. If I hit 4 on the keyboard, I can probably find, yeah, so I've got this one in the back of the neck also selected. So if I want to deselect this, I can hold down Control and just select over that one, and I'll know I just have these points selected. And I can move that out. Now I can see I'm not intersecting the skull on the side here anymore. I am a little bit, but I can tweak that as I add more resolution to my geometry. I can select these points. So you can just see I'm trying to select the points local to where I want to make the change. This is a spot here on the side of the head where the ear would eventually be placed, but we're not going to do that. And then you can see the back of the skull isn't quite fitting. So I can select these points, and I'm selecting the two, the one in the midline and the one right beside it. I just want to pull these back and maybe up a little bit. You can see I don't have that much resolution in the geometry back here, so I might need another edge loop in here eventually to approximate the curve of the back of the skull a little bit. And I can try and make it fit a little more closely. Now you can see I'm working in the low res mode, so I have 1 pressed on my keyboard. If I press 3 on my keyboard, it shows me the smooth version of the face. And this is good to work in back and forth in these early stages. You don't want to work in smooth mode too much in the beginning, because you'll try and add too much detail right away. So for now, try and stick to this low resolution mode. And change the shape gradually this way. It's going to pull at the back of the neck a little bit. So that's pretty good. I'm going to try and even this out. You want to keep your geometry as clean as possible and sort of as evenly spaced as you can as you go along. Now eventually when you start to add local detail, there will be some areas with more topology, so more edges and vertices and things, because smaller detail requires more faces and vertices and edges, whereas broad planes, where there's little change or little complex shape, you don't need that much. And you can see things like around the nose. This doesn't match very well, so you'll have nasal, mid-nasal, linear. So you can go in and start to tweak these things, pushing them in to match your drawing and the skull. So I'm only working from the skull right now, but you also have your drawings to rely on. And you can select all these points around the eye and push them into the middle if they're too far out. We're going to place them more exactly later on. But you can see that some tweaking needs to be done to have this match the shape of this face a little more closely. You can see I'm going in and moving these points around the nose. Mostly sticking to two in the midline, here, close to the midline. Sometimes selecting the third one out. And again, like I say, use your tissue depth markers. I don't want to influence you too much in mine, showing you the choices that I make. I want to see how everybody does it a little bit differently. Take them into label focus. There's this design to match your tissue depth markers here too. And so on. So before you go into the next step, just spend some time getting the shape of the head to match the shape of the skull without adding any more detail until the later stages. That's sort of the take-home message at this point, is always change the shape and always try and use the topology that you have to match the shape you're trying to make before adding new detail, by adding new topology, which means cutting a new edge loop, extruding faces, and so on. So don't do this now, but remember inserting edge loops from doing the ear, edit mesh, insert edge loop tool, click in here, and because I've got this topology flowing in this way, I can make a nice edge loop around the lips in Orbicularis oris. And around the eye. We're going to do a lot of that later on. But don't add any of this detail until you're satisfied that you've made the shape as close as you can at this point to match the skull. Because every time you add detail, it gets more and more difficult to edit. Now, if we just look at the topology of my template head here, you can see, like I said, I've got this sort of circular structure going around Orbicularis oris, around Orbicularis oculi. I've got this structure going in here for the nasolabial furrow. We have the structure for the neck. Now, we don't know much about the neck, but we do know that behind the ear is the mastoid process. This lump of bone here. Here's the external auditory meatus, where the tragus sits right over top of this. And there's a large muscle that allows you to turn your head. That goes from the mastoid process here, this lump of bone behind the ear, down to where the clavicle and sternum meet in the midline below the neck. And that muscle travels down here. So we've got the flow of that kind of going down here now. So we've got a template head that has everything we need to continue modeling. And that's what we'll do in the next steps. We're going to go through adding detail, putting in the detail for the eye, the mouth, and the nose, and all the other small details before we're finished. You can see there's nothing of the nose here. There's a beginning of a mouth and a beginning of an eye, but this is up to you to look at the video tutorials that I give you and some demonstrations in class, although there's not enough time in class to go over everything, and make those techniques work with the skull and the pre-visualization that you have. So you can take my instruction, which is on a different skull, different drawings, even different tissue depth markers, and you have to apply the techniques to your skull and your situation. Okay? Good luck.